I'm really excited to host this panel, particularly because of the panelists that we have joining us today. We're going to be talking about the gene and cell therapy translation opportunities, both the challenges as well as also the successes. And to help us do that, I'm joined by three panelists from different venture funds that really represent an incredibly broad swath of investments, of modalities, of strategies, and of thinking. And so I think it's just going to be a terrific discussion. First, Bob Nelson, who is Managing Director and Co-founder of Arch Ventures. Krish Parmar, who is also Managing Director at 5AM Ventures. And Dave Barry, who is a Managing Partner at Flagship Pioneering, as well as also co-founder and CEO of Valo Health. Looking forward to engaging with all three of you today on this really exciting topic. So Bob, I'm actually going to throw it over to you first, and I'm going to do that sort of in two ways. First, one of the things as we're thinking about the translation of these types of therapies is we've seen great success in some ways in the approvals, both in cell and gene therapies and FDA, as well as also some challenges as we're finding more money coming into the marketplace, more opportunities and programs coming into the clinic, and then really actually literally having to translate that. And so I wanted to go over to you first because you've done something incredibly interesting at Arch with resilience, which has both an enormous amount of capital and I think a grand vision. And I really would like to ask you to speak to what was the driver behind that in your thinking, and what are you looking to accomplish with that, including unmet needs and what you want to solve for using that entity?
Initially, it was just a response to the kind of slowness, or at least my perceived slowness and frustration with the supply chains in the pandemic. But I think what we discovered, which I think is an obvious thing, and we just all have to look around in gene and cell therapy to see it, is that we're kind of living in the word we used within the company is shit show of CMC variability, delays, failures, and kind of every process being a one-off. And it's because manufacturing is an afterthought, not a forethought. You get data, then you figure out how to make it. And then if you're an academic institution, you try to pass it to a biotech. And if you're, or a pharma, and they spend another 2 or 3 years trying to figure out what you did. The existing vendors will make a recipe if you give it to them, but we wanted to kind of rethink the way that the system works by anticipating in advance what the problems are. So that was the general goal, and we're thinking about that both in creating resilience to pandemics, i.e. creating a more decentralized digital system, and also that the same problems of the pandemic are the problems of gene therapy and cell therapy. So when you think about viral vectors or mRNA or delivery, or figuring out how to ways to rapidly prototype some type of a process that can work in a regulatory framework. So that's the general thought of the company, is to rethink the way that we make these things and invest in advance of the problem in even new modalities and automation and systems that can make these technologies not just more systematizable, but much, much cheaper, orders of magnitude cheaper. So if you think about what the semiconductor industry did, biotech has not done that. It's just been a reactive system, not a proactive system. So really what resilience wants to be is a proactive investor. So we're going to invest a huge amount in technologic innovation, and with universities, with biotech companies, and with pharma.
Terrific, thanks. And so, Kush, maybe I'd ask you to pick up a little bit on that. I mean, I think you at 5AM just personally have built a really interesting portfolio in the cell and gene therapy space. Your work in VOR and in Soma and Aquos really spans the gamut of the different technologies that can be utilized as these new modalities emerge, as well as also thinking about either very specific administration, for instance, in Aquos, we're in the ear, or systemic administration for some of these other companies. How have you guys been thinking both about some of the challenges that Bob surfaced and sort of their thinking around resilience, either on a company by company basis or across the portfolios you guys continue to invest in this space.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. Thank you for having me here as well. And to add to Bob's comments, I do think that we have a structural challenge currently in cell and gene therapy through the lens of entrepreneurship and company building. The parameters that we have to work with are go build it yourself, because there's no way you're going to be able to rely reliably on service providers to bring what's going to be central to your success, central to your value, and central to your risk and opportunity in building any of these companies. It is massively important and critical. So it was really about time for some major structural change there. So commend you really, Bob, for going at it head on. I think the portfolio that you just mentioned of companies that I'm actively involved in, I will say from past companies that I have been involved in gene and cell therapy. Prior to those, there's been a lot of learnings, and I'm not alone in this. I think we stand at a really interesting juncture in the history of where venture is in cell and gene therapy. It's a bit of this renaissance in this past decade that was outlined in the video right before this, which was always, and I think is the case today, always standing on the shoulders of the giants before us. At that juncture, the very first investors and venture community members who were entering gene and cell therapy were really off of decades of work within academia and starting to translate those initially. Where we stand today, actually, I think there's so many learnings. Bob just listed one of them. These are learnings that have come about just in the past number of years after a lot of investment in cell and gene therapy. And now we don't have just a bit of anecdotal evidence of the clinical challenges. Now we're seeing some of the commercial challenges and also the opportunities. And so I think one has a really well-informed, better informed venture community that understands the fact that you can have dramatic clinical benefits for patients, and let's make that scalable, to Bob's point, and that's the challenge that we have to address. In other areas where things have not gone so well, and that's actually presenting and clarifying the problem sets that we need to be developing solutions around, and I think that's a whole other generation of companies. Those companies you mentioned, Akuos, coming very much out of here, and the Mass General with Luke's foundational technology, really, I think, is an example of taking a foundational technology that seems to be working in other places, but really bringing a mission-centered focus with people who are deeply, deeply committed to the inner ear and very, very knowledgeable there, and bringing the right things together, which I think, at a later point, I'd love to touch on that, because I think the basis and the DNA of these companies for the future are going to be less and less so single widget technologies. It's really amalgamation of multiple tool sets. And I think us as the venture community need to be thinking a lot more about not taking a widget and making everything or a hammer and making everything a nail, but really being creative in how small to small kind of collaborations can happen, because that's where I think the greatest opportunities will come out.
That's terrific, and that's actually, I think, a great segue over to Dave. Flagship, I think, as now Flagship Pioneering, is a terrific name for the work that you guys have done in creating companies that are in some ways looking to even skip over some things and really bring new modalities in. I'd point out, actually, from my perspective, Ceres, which you could argue is a cell therapy, and really being at the forefront of thinking about bug as drug and that cell as a new modality, to Rubius, which I think really is potentially transformative in the way that they're thinking about the cell as a delivery mechanism. And now I would say your work at Valo, which maybe picks up on some of what Kush was talking about, which is sort of that integration of things and thinking broadly across networks. For you guys, how are you thinking about sort of these next generations and what's next, and thinking about making those leaps? Are you worried about some of the concerns and the hiccups that we're hitting along the way, or are you guys still out, full charge and thinking about not what's near, but what's next?
Well, thanks, Meredith, and it's great to be here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone. As we think about things in the context of Flagship, we're constantly thinking about how do we bring forth transformation? How do we think about where that next frontier is? How do we think about that next generation? And it's really this question of where can we bring disruptive, powerful science that can bring in a whole new frontier of therapeutics? Not a single drug, not a single opportunity, but a platform, and a platform that can reproducibly and reliably deliver. Now, this means a whole set of different things as we think about it, which is there's sets of the arena of biotechnology that have systematically been art, not science. Trying to bring that science, if not engineering, as a framework by which we can reliably and reproducibly bring forth therapeutics, that opens up doors. And even if we just think about it in the narrowest context of gene therapy focused on double knockout diseases, right? There's 3,000 of them. The community at large has brought forth treatments for about 35 of them over the 20-odd year history of the area. And if we want to be able to cure them all, we need to change the scale. We need to change the scope. We need to change the efficiency by which we're bringing this forward. And that's where pioneering really comes into play. But it also involves systematically changing the scope, the speed, the reliability of drug discovery and development. And that's where companies like Valo come into play, where we've been able to use things like human-centric data at each and every step of the drug discovery and development paradigm to rethink how we do it, to make it more human-centric, not built around, say, cells and mice. How we can make it much more of a parallel process, not a long serial process that has risk pushed all the way off to the end. And by doing that, we can start uncovering, for example, new targets much more efficiently. But these are the sorts of targets that are like the next PCSK9, i.e. in the history, they would have required finding that rare family that had that knockout and then trying to convert that into a drug. By getting the right scale of data, we can start understanding them systematically at scale with efficiency, and then directly converting them into therapeutics, not just of one modality, but many different modalities, the best modality that's fit for purpose. And in that case, then bringing them forth into an aligned, connected clinical trial that's designed to be fit for the patients that are most likely to benefit for that. And when we start thinking about these systems transformations, we have the opportunity not just to bring forth better drugs, more relevant drugs, more drugs, but we have the opportunity to be able to deliver on the promise that I think we all got into this industry for, which is to bring these treatments, these cures to patients as broadly, as quickly as possible.
Yeah, terrific. And I just wanted to see if Bob or Kush, you guys had any comments. Otherwise, I'd love to move to a next round of questions on what's been brought up.
I think just real quickly, that point is a great point. And what's happening is that there's this massive amount of parallelization happening and this innovation wave, right? So things like Valo and others, and even within pharma, the innovation wave is hitting a scalability problem. And that's both, if you look at gene and cell therapy, it's physical scalability, like how do we actually make these things, but it's also a regulatory scalability. In other words, you can't have a system that has 1,000 products or 3,000 products where every single one is a one-off manufacturing process. Like it won't happen. The FDA will go crazy and we'll have all the kind of variability that we have now. So you need some systematization, some miniaturization, and some kind of digitization of the process so that the regulators can actually pre-approve processes that then you can slot these new innovations in. And if that doesn't happen, we're going to just be sitting around with a bunch of cool innovations at least in the gene and cell therapy, things that kind of hit this wall.
Kush, any comments from you on that?
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think the initial challenges that we're all informed by the evidence that we're seeing in that moment, right? And I think a few years ago it was really a bit of clinical evidence, translational experimental medicine evidence. Now what we're seeing are, I think, more robust clinical data sets about what's actually working, what's not working, the immunological barriers, the technological barriers, the delivery barriers, and now these questions of scale, of reach, of access. And I think we're living those challenges right now. And there have been some great successes as well, no doubt, but they're becoming much more real. And so as that informs us as the early stage innovation community, it is our responsibility, I think, to be thinking about and maybe laughing at and being frustrated with with the discrepancy between what is possible and where things should be and where things are. And I think what's being highlighted by Dave and Bob is exactly that the fact that there's a major mismatch between what is possible right now and where things should be. I think it calls for new business models and definitely some change. It can't be just companies. I think there are regulatory frameworks and a number of other stakeholders that need to be part of this and party to this.
Yeah, and actually that's a great lead into what I was going to sort of throw back to you guys, and try not to shut or roll your eyes, but thinking about scale and thinking about manufacturing and thinking about systematizing and coming up with processes both by way of manufacture and regulatory that allow new ideas to come in, but actually to have a path forward that is not such a heavy lift, right? On a drug by drug or product by product basis, does that mean we need some consortiums? Does that mean we need more government funding as well for this, or does this actually come back to us as the venture community putting up just more and more capital to get to that scale? Curious how you guys are thinking about those opportunities where it's venture and we should be the ones that are paving that way, or other stakeholders, Kush, as you just suggested, participating or maybe even leading on some of those efforts.
I think they have to engage. I'm sorry, I'll just chime in first here. On the long tail diseases, I think every one of our companies, I imagine, have considered those diseases within our companies, of course, focusing on the ones that make a lot of sense and actually have immediate commercial applications and opportunity right there. But the long tail opportunities, I think all of us have had sit in our boardrooms thinking about, do we start a foundation around these and how do we enable access so that well-meaning families and patient communities can support the development of those. That's not sustainable. That's not how we're going to get there. I think it's us working with the existing framework and trying to see if good things can happen. But if we're going to do it robustly and truly get there in our lifetimes, I think it absolutely requires not just a venture community being in an echo chamber. I think it needs to be stakeholders that wake up to the possibility. And I think it does require systems. It requires thinking about modalities, breaking them down. What are the actual risks and opportunities within each of those modalities, and what need to be the parameters we care about as a society, and incorporate the risk benefit for those patient populations that are going to be very rare.
Yeah, I mean, part of this, to be honest, it gets a little bit into that so-called definition of insanity, right? Keep on doing the same thing, expecting a different result. We're trying to, I think what we need to do, and this is where the innovation community, I think, is going, is it's about changing the system. We have an inherited legacy system that's arguably 100 years old. It's a point-to-point system. It's intrinsically inefficient. It's intrinsically disintegrated. The opportunity that's in front of us right now is to actually bring it together, create better alignment, create this opportunity to be substantially more efficient in the way we discover drugs and develop drugs. And this is that time where I think innovation can deliver solutions that can transform on a timeline and probability of success basis that ultimately lend themselves to more drugs. I mean, if we start getting critical about the drug discovery and development process, just pick an arbitrary basis. The way we try to choose as to whether a drug is going to be toxic in a person is we put it into a mouse and we put it into a monkey, and we then deem whatever that result to be predictive of what happens in a human. But as of where we sit today, 60% of drugs that go into people still fail because of tox. That means these are systems that are no more than 40% predictive. That's not something that we would consider reliable. That's not something we would consider robust. There have to be opportunities for us to be rethinking the frameworks that we're looking at each and every step. And the more that we can reduce these fail modes, the more we can create an interconnected system. I think the more we bring these therapies together. I think it's on the innovator community, whether the investors, the entrepreneurs, to develop these new technologies and push them forward, but not to push them forward in silos. To think about this as we are building the new system, we're building the system of the future, the system that offers the promise that we're looking to achieve. And with that sort of mentality, I think we can all come together and start delivering these therapeutics for big diseases, for important diseases, the ones that take the lives of our friends and loved ones.
I think that's where where we have to partner with government to educate them as to where we're going to get stuck, right? So right now the FDA has even within their current system, the ability to approve a process in advance of a product, but that does not happen. So we have to have a system where processes can be validated, and then we can drop all this new innovation in it. So every single manufacturing change is not a new clinical trial or a new validation study. And we do need to rethink the system of innovation, but there's a lot of funding coming in this current set of bills to academic institutions for consortia with other universities and also private companies. And we should figure out ways of testing these new kind of innovation systems, but also regulatory processes to give confidence to the FDA that new system is going to work. But right now, if we continue on the way in cell and gene therapy, where every single product is a one-off, a new process, and you have to go through validation, even if you think about the next pandemic, if we don't validate our existing systems in advance, right? If we have a 20% fatal virus, what are we going to do? Right? If you don't know those things are going to be safe in humans, because you're not going to be able to run a clinical trial in that scenario, just to be clear, like you're going to go right into humans. So you need to think, if we spend a year running a clinical trial in the next pandemic with a 10 or 20% case fatality rate, like we're just, that doesn't work. So we need to rethink the system for the pandemic. We need to rethink the same kind of processes for cell and gene therapy, so we can handle this innovation way. So we have a lot of educating to do of regulatory agencies on these new technologies and of legislators, so that we don't end up kind of in the wrong place. And if you think about even things like drug pricing, if we don't invest a lot in making these things cheaper, which is the same thing we need to do to systematize them, they'll never be accessible to mass patients or the rest of the world. So we kind of have to rethink the entire value chain and also the way that we make them.
Yeah, thanks. So we're down to just our last 2 minutes. I think we've actually covered just an enormous amount in such a short period of time, talking about investing at scale, talking about challenges with both regulatory and manufacturing, as well as opportunities there, thinking about both the talent pool, et cetera. With just the last 2 minutes left, I guess I'd like to end not necessarily on an optimistic note, but on a what are we excited about note. So instead of sort of talking about where the lifts that we need to make, where are the things that we're most excited about as we're looking forward, maybe away from some of those, assuming that, let's say, we can solve all of them within the next 5 to 10 years, build all of these pieces. Kush, over to you when you're, putting your 5 a.m. hat on and thinking about the next investment that you're going to make or the next thing that you're excited about digging into or looking at. What are you guys thinking about? Where are you most excited in the GCT space?
Maybe I'll speak to some of the newer projects, and because I think they do speak to what I'm very excited about. It's Scalable Solutions. I mean, Bob just brought this up, and I know has interest here as well, and David as well, and Flagship. It's really technologies that can be just dramatic in the simplification of the delivery of the medicine, that can confer the kind of transformational benefit that these very cumbersome procedures, let's just call them what they are, they're very complicated, cumbersome, time-intensive, clinically intensive procedures for a lot of first-generation advances in cell and gene therapy. Can we make that a much more simplified treatment? And I think that is what, in my view, those are technological solutions that can immediately build on the clinical evidence base, which is very robust about the transformational clinical impact it can have, but now make it much more accessible in rich countries and not so rich countries as well. So I think that is a tremendous opportunity that I'm very, very excited about. So thinking about scale and access as the fundamental core. And the other part of it is, I think, huge synergies between different, I don't want to trivialize things by calling them widgets, but technological innovations. In isolation, interesting, but I do think that there's an increasing awareness between my peers that actually bringing them together, that's where the magic can really happen, where you unlock solutions. I'm always thinking about solutions for that patient population, for a need, and what does it take, not being married to a singular technology.
Terrific. And while we're out of time, I still want to actually ask Dave and Bob to lend maybe their last 30 seconds of also where they're interested as well.
Sure. So really quickly, we see a lot of excitement in both the cell and gene therapy spaces and beyond. We're particularly optimistic about the opportunities that build off of companies like Moderna that came out of our shop in expanding what you can do in the genetic and around the genetic space, where we can think about the next generation of RNA, the next generation of gene therapy type technologies, companies like Omega Therapeutics that are looking at epigenomics and how we can think about regulation, where it's not just missing genes, but where the cure is actually inside of us, and we can just simply, if you allow me to put it that way, unlock it. We're very excited about some of the next generation that we can see in cell therapies, both the canonical, if you will, and how we can think about more specific engineering, more specific targeting, dissecting the immune system. At the same time, the non-canonical, things that stem from the microbiome and beyond. But I think the overarching trend that we've been really encouraged by is the power of data and computation and what that can deliver just by giving us an ability to be entirely nonlinear in the way that we think about uncovering new drugs, new drug opportunities, and developing them to become something that can be a successful therapeutic.
Terrific. And Bob, we started with you, and I'll ask to end with you. Resilience is going to be terrific. What's next for you guys? What are you looking at beyond?
We're thinking a lot about the same things that Flagship thinks about, and 5AM actually. So RNA, we're thinking about the way the epigenome kind of, how we can manipulate things with new editing technologies. We're thinking a lot about delivery and targeting, and things like rejuvenation. Thinking about how to really take a lot of these technologies more systematically and more targeted into the body, or to make cells, kind of silent in a way that we can scale them. So, and using a lot of the techniques that Dave was describing to be able to kind of systematize not just the discovery piece, but the production piece. And optimize the system using, kind of better better computational thinking along the way. So it's just a tremendously exciting time, as you all know. And I really think that I don't really see anything in the way of this kind of innovation wave, other than if we are, kind of accidentally swept up in this, kind of pharma drug pricing wave, and somehow they damage the innovation infrastructure that's going to cure us all, and put some of the hospitals' wings, transforming them into outpatient centers for curing people with gene therapies and cell therapies instead of treating people that are really sick, and then some regulatory kind of innovation as well.
Terrific. Well, thanks you all. I think we actually now have our theme for the panel next year. So I look forward to coming back and getting updates on all of these exciting opportunities. Thanks for the panel. This was great.